The sea had been restless that week, its waves gnawing at the shore like a hungry thing denied. By the time the fishermen stumbled upon the body, the sun had not yet cleared the morning fog, and the air tasted of salt and something older, something that did not belong. He swore later that he almost missed the man entirely, for he was dressed well, too well for the ragged stretch of coast, his boots polished, his dark wool coat free of the usual seafarer's grime. But it was the stillness that betrayed him, not the stillness of sleep, but that deep and permanent quiet that makes the skin shiver. The stranger lay half-propped against a worn sandstone bank, his head tilted slightly as though listening to the murmur of the tide. His hair was neatly combed, his face clean-shaven, and there was no mark of violence upon him. Yet his eyes, half-closed beneath lashes that might have seemed delicate in another setting, spoke of a sudden departure from this world. They were empty in a way that made the fisherman step back, suddenly aware that he was intruding on something sacred, or perhaps cursed. By the time the constable arrived, the day had brightened into a brittle autumn morning. A small crowd had gathered, dock workers, wives with baskets, children darting forward before being sharply pulled back. Whispers swept through them like wind through tall grass. No one recognized the man. He was not from the port, of that they were certain. His clothes were of fine tailoring, the sort favored by gentlemen of the inner city. A railway ticket stub was found in one pocket, the origin smudged by damp, the destination illegible. It was Constable Hargreaves who discovered the oddity, a tightly folded scrap of paper in the fob pocket of the man's trousers. So small and so deliberately hidden, it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the way the fabric resisted his fingers. The words upon it were in a foreign tongue, the ink slightly blurred, as though it had endured more than one storm. It read simply, Taman Shud. No one present could decipher it, though an elderly dock worker muttered that it looked like no English he had ever seen. The words carried an uneasy weight, as though speaking them aloud might invite something unwelcome. Hargreaves slipped the scrap into an envelope and sealed it at once. The body was conveyed to the coroner's office, where Dr. Wilcox began his examination under the low hum of a gas lamp. He noted the man's remarkable condition, no wounds, no bruising, no sign of illness that could be discerned from the exterior. Yet there was a peculiar tightness to the jaw and a faint staining of the fingernails, both of which whispered of poison to a trained eye. Wilcox leaned closer, the hairs on his neck rising. If poison it was not one he could readily identify, not arsenic, not laudanum, not the bitter almond scent of cyanide. The inquest began the following day in the drafty magistrate's hall. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some swore they had seen the man on the tram 2 evenings prior. Others claimed he had been spotted at the public house near the harbor, nursing a single glass and speaking to no one. A young maid from the Bellevue boarding house insisted he had come to inquire about a room, but left when told there were no vacancies. In each telling, he was alone, polite, and spoke with the faintest accent that no one could place. It was on the 3rd day after the discovery that the real strangeness began. Inspector Caldwell, brought in from the city to assist, had the man's clothing examined more thoroughly. Hidden in the lining of his coat was a tiny, concealed pocket, hand-sewn and almost invisible to the touch. Inside, neatly folded, was a strip torn from a book. Upon it, in the same foreign script as before, were the words Taman Shud. Caldwell recognized them at once as matching the scrap found in the fob pocket, as if the two had been placed in different spots deliberately. But what book? And why tear only those words? Efforts were made to trace the origin of the paper. Printers were consulted, booksellers questioned. Eventually, an antiquarian claimed to have seen the phrase in a volume of Persian poetry, translated into English some decades prior, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The final verse in that book closed with those very words, Taman Shud, meaning, in the old tongue, ended or finished. The revelation sent a shiver through the court. Was it a farewell, a signal, or something darker, a mark left by the killer to mock them? The stranger's belongings were pitifully few. A railway ticket, a scrap of paper, the clothes upon his back, and a half-empty packet of cigarettes not sold anywhere in the district. No hat, though such an accessory was customary for a man of his standing. No watch, no wallet, no means of identification. It was as though he had stepped into the world fully formed and then stepped back out, leaving nothing of himself behind. Caldwell, not a man prone to fancy, began to suspect the case would not be solved by ordinary means. There was something theatrical in the arrangement of the body, something deliberate in the choice of location. If the man had been poisoned, why here, upon this lonely stretch of shore? Why not in the city, where death might pass unnoticed among the tenements? On the 5th evening after the discovery, a messenger arrived at the police station with news from a local bookseller. A copy of the Rubaiyat had been found abandoned on the rear seat of a carriage at the railway station. Inside, the final page was missing, torn clean away, and on the inside back cover, faint indentations from handwriting could be seen. The book was brought to Caldwell, who held it as one might hold a fragile relic. The missing page would have borne the words Taman Shud. More chilling still, faint writing, carefully recovered with a lead pencil and dust, was not a letter but a series of letters arranged like a code. They formed no words in English, no obvious cipher, and yet they felt intentional, the product of a mind disciplined in secrecy. Speculation ran wild. Some whispered of foreign agents, spies moving through the ports, exchanging messages in ways the untrained I would overlook. Others muttered of secret societies, of lovers' pacts gone awry, of revenge exacted for slights invisible to outsiders. In the boarding houses and taverns, the tale grew taller with each telling. The man had been seen walking with a veiled woman. He had been heard humming an unfamiliar tune. He had carried in his pocket a key that opened no lock in the city. None of these claims could be proved, but neither could they be disproved. Caldwell pursued the veiled woman rumor with particular vigor, tracing it to a seamstress named Clara, who swore she had glimpsed such a pair by the gas lamps near the pier 2 nights before the body was found. The woman, she claimed, was tall, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her face was hidden, but her gloves were of such fine leather as could only be purchased in London. Caldwell found no trace of her in any of the guest registries. The weeks that followed did not yield answers so much as more shadows. The inquest adjourned without naming a cause of death, the magistrate declaring that the matter remained open. The body, unclaimed, lay in the cold earth of the pauper's field, though Caldwell had seen to it that the grave was marked with a simple stone. Yet the image of the stranger haunted him. In quiet moments, he would picture the man seated somewhere inland, perhaps at a desk by candlelight, tearing a page from a cherished book and folding it with great care. What had passed through his mind as he performed that act? Resignation? Fear? Or the satisfaction of completing a task long in the making? The tides continued their endless work, erasing and remaking the shoreline. The fisherman's footprints vanished within hours that first morning, yet the questions lingered, as enduring and as corrosive as salt upon stone. Somewhere in the city, perhaps in a dim back room, someone knew the truth of Taman Shud, and perhaps they were waiting for the right moment to speak, or to strike again. The fog had rolled in heavier than anyone could recall, muffling the bells from the harbor and turning the gas lamps into dim, floating orbs. It was the sort of night where sound carried strangely, where the scrape of a boot on cobblestone might seem to come from nowhere at all. Somewhere in that damp murk, Rook moved like a man pursued by something more than the law. He kept to the narrow lanes, the ones where the shadows clung like damp rags to the walls, and made his way toward the Black Gull Tavern. The Black Gull was no stranger to secrets. Its timber walls had soaked up decades of whispers, gamblers boasting of winnings they never collected, dockside deals struck over cheap gin, and plans spoken in languages no one else in the room could understand. Tonight, though, the place was quieter than usual. A handful of regulars hunched over their mugs, their eyes drawn not to the card games or the barmaid's sharp tongue, but to the stranger in the farthest corner. Rook didn't look at him, not directly. He ordered his drink, barely tasting the bitter ale before making his way to the back room. It was here, behind a warped door with a rusted latch, that he slid a small tin box from his coat pocket. His hands, though calloused, trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside lay a strip of paper, weathered, the corners curling, bearing the same haunting words whispered along the waterfront these past weeks. Taman Shud. The ink was faded, but the deliberate script was unmistakable. He stared at it for a long time, as though it might yield its secrets under sufficient scrutiny. But if the message was for him, it was written in a tongue beyond mere language. He thought of burning it. Indeed, the charred edges showed he had once brought it to a flame. Yet something had stayed his hand, some half-conscious dread that destroying it would bring down more trouble than keeping it ever could. A knock sounded, sharp, deliberate, on the door. Rook's spine went rigid. Without thinking, he slid the paper back into the tin, snapped the lid shut, and shoved it beneath the loose plank in the floorboards. His boot pressed down hard as the latch turned. Inspector Caldwell filled the doorway, his frame cutting a stark silhouette against the hall's dim light. He closed the door behind him, letting the noise of the tavern fade to a muted hum. His gaze moved slowly across the room, lingering on the table, the shelves, the gaps between the boards. It was not the gaze of a man idly looking, but one weighing, measuring, storing details away for later. "You've been difficult to find," Caldwell said at last, his voice steady, almost conversational. Rook forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've no reason to be found, Inspector. I've done nothing to bring you to my door." "Perhaps," Caldwell replied, taking a seat uninvited. "But there's a matter of a dead man on the shore. Well-dressed, unknown to anyone here. A scrap of foreign words in his pocket. And you, Mr. Rook, have been making inquiries about a certain book in which those very words appear." The mention of the book was deliberate, a drop of blood in the water to see if Rook would flinch. He didn't, at least not outwardly, but Caldwell's eyes were the sort that noticed even the tightening of a jaw. "I ask after many books," Rook said evenly. "Words have a way of traveling. Sometimes they arrive before their meaning does." Outside, a foghorn wailed, a long, mournful cry that seemed to seep through the floorboards. It was a sound Rook had heard all his life, but tonight it carried an undercurrent that set his teeth on edge. Caldwell leaned forward. "Where did you see the words first?" But before Rook could answer, a commotion stirred in the main room. A barmaid's voice rose, sharp with anger, followed by the crash of a chair. Caldwell rose swiftly, stepping back toward the door, but Rook didn't follow. He stayed in the back room, breathing shallowly, listening as the noise swelled and then ebbed. When Caldwell returned, his eyes were harder, more certain. "You are holding something back," the inspector said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. And then Caldwell was gone, his boots striking a slow, deliberate rhythm down the hall. That night, Rook dreamed of the shore, not the busy harbor, but a desolate stretch where the tide crept in silently, as if reluctant to disturb the body lying there. In the dream, the man was still seated against the bank, his eyes half open, but now he turned his head toward Rook and spoke. The words were indistinct, muffled by the roar of unseen waves, but Rook knew, without knowing how, that they were the same as those on the paper. The next morning, a boy from the docks arrived at the tavern with a folded scrap of newsprint. Rook took it with cautious hands. Inside, written in the same foreign script, were the words "It is not finished." The contrast to Taman Shud ended was jarring. He read it again, tracing the strokes with his finger. Not finished. It was then he realized he had been followed from the harbor 3 nights ago. Not by Caldwell, but by a thin man with a limp, whose face he could not clearly recall. He had dismissed it at the time, thinking the man a vagrant or a petty thief. Now he wondered if that shadowed figure had been the messenger of this new warning. In another part of the city, far from the fog and the salt air, Clara the seamstress stitched late into the night by the dim glow of her oil lamp. A scrap of silk lay across her lap, but her thoughts were not on the needle in her hand. They were on the stranger, a tall woman in the fine London gloves, who had visited her shop a fortnight ago. She had come not for a gown or a hem, but for a question, whether Clara had seen a man carrying a Persian book of poetry. The woman's voice had been calm, but her eyes had searched the shop like a hawk's. Clara had lied, saying she knew nothing. The woman had left without a word, but as she passed through the doorway, she had dropped something into the basket near the door. Clara had not noticed until later that night, when she found an ivory hairpin carved with delicate patterns that matched those in the Persian border designs she had once seen in an illustrated manuscript. The following day, Clara heard of the body on the shore. She told no one of the woman or the hairpin, though she now kept it hidden in a small box beneath her bed. Weeks passed, but the threads of the case did not untangle. Caldwell pursued the matter with a dogged patience that unnerved those he questioned. Each time he thought he had reached the heart of it, the truth seemed to slide away, replaced by new and more baffling fragments. A name overheard in a tea house, a train ticket with its destination rubbed away, a map with a single coastal town circled in red. And yet, in the quiet hours, when the streets were empty save for the watchman's slow patrol, Caldwell would think back to the copy of the Rebbe found in the railway carriage. He would recall the indentations on the back page, letters that formed no words, and yet seemed too purposeful to be random. More than once he had laid them out on his desk, trying to match them to a code he might recognize. None fit, and the more he stared at them, the more he felt they were not meant to be read at all, but to be recognized. By whom, he did not know. One night, well past midnight, Caldwell left his office and walked to the edge of the harbor. The fog was heavy, but in the distance he could make out the faint glow of the lighthouse. He stood there a long time, listening to the lap of the water against the pilings. Somewhere in the blackness beyond the shore, a ship's bell rang, followed by a low whistle, two short, one long. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He had heard that signal before, years ago, in a case that had never made the papers. The next morning, he called for the old dock records. We found there was a name, one that had appeared briefly in connection with a vessel registered in Port Said, a vessel whose cargo manifest had been sealed under orders from the Foreign Office. And among the list of passengers from its last voyage was a description. Male, mid-30s, well-dressed, with an accent not easily placed. The man's destination unknown, his fate unrecorded. Under the jaundiced light of a gas lamp, the railway station seemed a place suspended between worlds, neither fully of the waking city, nor entirely of its shadows. The last train had long since departed, yet the cavernous hall echoed with a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was a solitary porter sweeping the marble floor, his broom making a sound like whispers dragged across stone. On the far bench, in a corner few lamps touched, sat a man with his hat brim drawn low. He was reading, or at least pretending to, the tattered remains of a book whose final page was missing. The porter did not notice when a second figure approached, moving with a quiet surety. She wore a long traveling cloak, and though the hood shadowed her face, the flash of fine leather gloves was unmistakable. She did not speak. Instead, she paused by the bench, placed a folded slip of paper on the man's knee, and walked away without breaking stride. The man waited until she was gone before picking it up. His fingers traced the familiar strokes of the script, foreign, elegant, and unyielding. Elsewhere in the city, Clara lay awake, the hairpin warm in her palm despite the chill in her small room. She could not shake the feeling that someone had been at her door earlier, the soft tread just beyond the threshold lingering in her mind like the aftertaste of something bitter. She thought of the tall woman, the searching eyes, the question about the Persian poetry. She had told herself she kept the hairpin because it was beautiful, but tonight she admitted the truth. She kept it because it was proof. Should anyone one day accuse her of imagining the whole encounter? Inspector Caldwell had not slept in 2 nights. The code from the back of the Rebbe sat on his desk beside a collection of oddities. A chipped porcelain teacup from the Black Gull storeroom, a railway ticket whose ink had faded beyond recognition, and a scrap of oilcloth bearing a faint scent of camphor. They seemed, to any casual observer, the worthless detritus of unrelated matters. But Caldwell felt certain they were connected, if only he could find the thread. That morning he called on a former colleague, a linguist who had once worked for the Postal Inspection Service. The man examined the coded letters with the curiosity of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. Not a simple substitution, he said finally, but there's rhythm here. Repetition. Could be an acrostic, could be initials. But initials to what? That's the trouble. Caldwell left with no clearer answer, though the suggestion of initials lodged in his mind like a burr. The weather turned that week. Wind howled down the narrow streets, carrying with it the tang of the sea. On the 7th evening after the station sighting, a fisherman brought in a catch tangled with a length of oilskin. Inside was a small wooden box, its corners worn smooth by time. Caldwell was summoned to the wharf. When he prized it open, The hinges groaned like an old man's joints. Within lay a gold fob watch, its glass cracked. Its hands stopped at precisely 17 minutes past 9. Beneath it, folded and brittle with damp, was another slip of paper bearing the same foreign words, Taman Shud. The watch's back plate bore an inscription, not in any alphabet Caldwell recognized, but in tiny, meticulous characters etched in a spiral toward the center. He took it to a jeweler, who could only shake his head. "This isn't for telling time," the man murmured. "It's for telling something else entirely." That night, as rain lashed against his window, Caldwell thought of the woman in the gloves. Rumors said she had been seen again, this time near the edge of the old cemetery, where the stone angels leaned under centuries of lichen. She had spoken to no one, but had paused by a grave so weathered its name was unreadable. Witnesses claimed she laid a single white rose there before vanishing into the mist. Rook, meanwhile, had not returned to the Black Gull since Caldwell's visit. He stayed instead in a loft above a cooper's shop, where the smell of tar and sawdust masked his own unease. From beneath the floorboards, he retrieved the tin box nightly, unfolding the paper as though the words might shift under his gaze. He knew more than he had told Caldwell. Knew, in fact, that the paper was not the first message, but the last in a chain that stretched back months. The others he had destroyed, each bearing different words, though all in the same hand. It was not until he saw the gold fob watch, described in the evening edition of the paper, that he understood the danger had returned to the shore. For the watch, too, had once passed through his hands, briefly, years ago, when it was pressed into his palm by a dying man in the alley behind the eastern docks. The man had whispered something then, a string of sounds that meant nothing to Rook, but matched the cadence of the foreign words on the paper. He had thought it the delirium of the dying. Now he was not so certain. In a small attic room above the seamstress's shop, Clara's lamp burned late again. She had begun to notice peculiarities, footsteps that paused beneath her window, shadows that lingered too long across the street. The hairpin remained hidden, yet she felt as though it called to the one who had left it. One night she dreamed she was walking along the beach at low tide. The sand was strewn with scraps of paper, all bearing the same two words. She bent to pick one up, but the letters blurred and rearranged themselves into something she could not read. When she woke, her pillow was damp, though whether from sweat or tears, she could not say. Caldwell's investigation took him beyond the city to a coastal hamlet where the wind seemed to speak in the chimneys. There, in a derelict boarding house, he found a ledger whose last pages had been torn away. The remaining entries showed payments from a Mr. S, always in cash, always for room for. The innkeeper, an old man with clouded eyes, remembered the lodger only vaguely. A quiet gentleman, fond of walking the shore at night, who kept a book of strange poetry on his bedside table. When Caldwell asked if he still had the book, the old man shook his head. It was gone the morning he left, he said, or the morning he didn't leave, depending on how you look at it. He would explain no further. Returning to the city by rail, Caldwell found himself sharing a carriage with a woman whose gloved hands rested lightly on a small traveling case. She did not speak, but when the train slowed for a crossing, she glanced at him, and for the briefest instant he thought he saw recognition in her eyes. He almost asked her name, but she turned away, and when they reached the station, she disappeared into the crowd before he could follow. By now the threads of the mystery stretched in all directions. A dead man on the shore, scraps of paper with foreign words, a coded page from a book, a gold watch stopped at an inexplicable hour, a woman whose presence was felt more than it was seen. And though the connections between them lay just beyond reach, Caldwell knew they were there, woven together in a pattern as deliberate as the etching on the watch's back. In his office that night, he spread the pieces before him. The papers, the ticket, the oilcloth, the watch. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, and somewhere far off, a ship's bell rang twice. He closed his eyes and listened, as though the answer might come not in words, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of the sea itself. A hard frost had settled over the city, crisping the cobblestones underfoot and leaving the rooftops dusted with white. In the early hours, before the market wagons began their slow creak along the main thoroughfare, a solitary figure moved through the narrow lanes near the river. He was tall, with his coat collar turned high against the bite of the air, and he carried no lantern. Those who glimpsed him from behind their shutter swore later that he did not seem to leave footprints, though whether that was the trick of the frost or the man's own careful tread was anyone's guess. By the time the first light spread over the eastern rooftops, he was gone, but on the stone steps leading down to the water lay a folded scrap of paper. The ferryman who found it turned it over in his calloused hands, frowning at the precise, foreign script, Taman Shud. The ferryman did not know the meaning, but he had heard the words whispered in the taverns lately, carried on a tide of rumor and unease. He passed it to a constable without comment, glad to be rid of it. Inspector Caldwell examined the scrap that afternoon, holding it beneath the beam of light that angled through his office window. The paper was of a different quality than the others, thicker, with faint watermarks only visible at a certain angle. A maker's mark, perhaps, though one he did not recognize. He slipped it into an envelope, marking it with the date, and set it alongside the others. His desk had begun to look less like an investigator's workspace, and more like an altar to a puzzle that refused to be solved. In another quarter of the city, Clara sat in her shop, the day's work neatly stacked in a basket by the window. She had not seen the tall woman again, but she had received a package the day before, unmarked, wrapped in brown paper and tied with rough twine. Inside had been a length of silk the color of old blood and a slip of paper with a single phrase: "Return what is not yours." No signature, no address. She had not told anyone about it, not even her closest friend, though the unease it stirred kept her awake at night. She found herself touching the hairpin more often, as if its smooth surface could steady her nerves. But the weight of the words, "Return what is not yours," pressed against her thoughts like a stone against a door. Rook, meanwhile, had been watching the wharves. From his vantage on the roof of a cooper's shed, he could see the comings and goings of the smaller vessels that slipped into poured undercover of darkness. He was looking for a particular signal. 2 short lantern flashes followed by 1 long. It had been years since he'd last seen it, but when it appeared just after midnight, his stomach tightened. The ship that gave it was a squat, withered sloop, her sails patched and her hull stained with salt. The next morning, he went down among the dock workers, blending in with their coarse speech and heavier coats. He found the ship moored at the farthest pier, her crew already unloading crates bound for the warehouses. Among them was a man with a limp, moving with the slow precision of someone accustomed to carrying fragile things. Rook recognized him at once, though he could not say from where. He followed him at a distance until the man slipped into a side alley and was lost from view. That evening, Caldwell received an anonymous note. It was written in the same cramped hand as the railway book's code, but in English this time. Room 4, ask for the ledger. No signature, no clue as to its sender. He did not hesitate. The boarding house at that address was small and ill-kept, the sort of place that rented by the week to men who worked the docks and paid in coins that bore the marks of foreign ports. The landlady was a bent woman with sharp eyes, and when Caldwell asked for the ledger, she hesitated only a moment before retrieving it from behind the counter. The book spine was cracked, its pages yellowed and faintly smelling of mildew. Room 4's entries were sporadic, never a name, always Mr. S, in the same careful script. Payment was always in advance. The last entry was dated a month before the body was found on the shore. Beneath it, in faint pencil, were the letter CCM, followed by a series of numbers. Caldwell copied them down before closing the book. When he asked about Mr. S, the landlady pursed her lips, kept to himself, polite, clean, always carried a book, foreign writing in it like poetry. "Do you still have the book?" Caldwell asked. "No," she said, shaking her head. He took it with him, or someone did. Rook heard of Caldwell's visit soon after. Word traveled quickly in certain circles, and he knew the inspector was drawing closer to truths best left buried. That night, he retrieved the tin box once more, unfolding the Taman Shud slip and setting it beside the other fragment he had kept hidden, the one that read "It is not finished." Placed together, the 2 slips seemed to mock each other, one declaring an end, the other a denial of it. He wondered which was the truth, or if either was. Claire's shop saw fewer customers as winter deepened, but one afternoon, a man came in asking for alterations to a coat. When she examined it, she found in the lining a concealed pocket, the stitching so fine it might have gone unnoticed forever. Inside was a narrow strip of paper, its edges frayed. The ink faded to a ghost of itself. She froze when she saw the words. The man noticed her stillness. "Something wrong, miss?" "No," she lied, sliding the paper back into place. "Just admiring the workmanship." That night, she removed it again, smoothing it out under the lamplight. The same foreign script. She had never learned its meaning, but she no longer needed to. The pattern of the letters was etched into her memory, and the sight of them sent a chill through her bones. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell began to suspect that the coded letters from the book's back page were not meant for him at all. They were a message between two others, perhaps the dead man and whoever had left the watch, perhaps Rook and the woman in gloves. He considered approaching Rook again, but he knew the man would give nothing freely. One bitterly cold morning, the body of the man with the limp was found near the edge of the old cemetery. No sign of a struggle, no obvious cause of death. In his pocket was a railway ticket from 3 days prior, the destination worn beyond recognition, and a matchbook from the Black Gull. Caldwell examined the body himself and found, tucked into the man's boot, a folded page torn from the rubaiyat. It was not the final page, but one from the middle, its verses underlined in a trembling hand. Back at his desk, Caldwell read the underlined lines over and over. They spoke of journeys and endings, of meetings that were not by chance. But it was the final underlined phrase that held his attention. "And when like her, O Saki, you shall pass." The ink had bled in places, but the emphasis was clear. He could not shake the image of the gloved woman at the cemetery, laying a rose on an unmarked grave. Somewhere in the city, Clara sat alone in her room, the hairpin before her, the blood-red silk folded neatly beside it. She had begun to suspect that returning it might be the only way to make the footsteps and shadows cease. But the thought of seeking out the woman filled her with a dread she could not name. And on the docks, Rook watched the tide pull away from the pilings, revealing the black, glistening stones beneath. He thought of the slips of paper, the gold watch, the man on the shore. Pieces of a design he could see only in fragments, like a map torn into too many parts. Somewhere among them was the truth, but in a language none of them had yet learned to read. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the cobblestones of Somerton's narrow lanes gleamed like black glass under the gaslight. In the shuttered rooms above the apothecary, Eliza Hargrove paced with the restless agitation of someone who had waited too long for news that would not come. She had burned the letter twice in her mind before daring to destroy the real one. Even now, scraps of it lay in the hearth, stubborn curls of ash refusing to break apart. The words were etched into her memory, phrases that hinted at debts not of money, but of silence. Down in the shop, the scent of laudanum and camphor clung to the air. The glass jars along the shelves seemed to glisten, as though the very humidity could coax poison from their contents. Eliza heard footsteps outside, deliberate and slow, and for a brief moment she thought they might belong to her brother. But when the bell above the door chimed, it was Inspector Caldwell who entered, his coat dripping rain, his expression unreadable. He spoke her name softly, as though not to startle her, yet the weight of it made her knees feel hollow. "Another was found," he said. She did not need to ask what he meant. The image sprang into her mind, the washed-up figure on the sand, as motionless as the stone seawall behind him. But Caldwell's next words made her grip the counter until her knuckles whitened. This one was not alone. He set a small, water-stained ledger on the counter. It was bound in cheap leather, its pages swollen from the damp, but when she opened it, her breath caught. Names were listed in a neat but hurried hand, each accompanied by a symbol she recognized. The same strange flourish that had been at the bottom of the note in the dead man's pocket. Some of the names she knew, merchants, ship captains, even a magistrate. Others were strangers. "Where did you?" "It was found under the pier," Caldwell said, his voice low, weighted down with a stone. The tide hadn't reached it yet. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Eliza looked toward the street. For a heartbeat, she saw a figure standing across the way, cloaked and still, watching the apothecary with the posture of one who had been there far too long. By the time she blinked, it was gone. That night, unable to sleep, she sat by the dim glow of the hearth and copied the ledger's entries onto a sheet of paper. She stopped at the sixth name. A drop of ink had fallen there, marring the page. It wasn't hers. She turned the ledger sideways, studying the mark. It was darker, as if made by different ink, and it smeared under her finger. Somewhere, someone else had held this book recently, and if Caldwell's suspicion was correct, that someone was still alive and still close. By dawn, the rain had thinned to a mist. Eliza stepped outside with the copied list tucked deep in her sleeve. She had resolved to take it to the lighthouse, where the keeper owed her a favor and knew how to send messages quietly along the coast. But halfway down the lane, she caught sight of Rook leaning against a post, a matchstick rolling between his teeth. He did not greet her. He merely tipped his hat, and she saw in his eyes the flicker of recognition. It was then she realized something chilling. Rook was not surprised to see her with the list. He was surprised she still had it. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries torn ragged by the wind sweeping in from the gray sea. The shoreline at Somerton was nearly empty that evening, save for the long shadows cast by the skeletal frame of the old pier. The tide was low, the water retreating like some great wounded beast, leaving behind ribs of driftwood and tangles of kelp that glistened under the fading light. Eliza moved slowly, her boots crunching over damp sand, the hood of her cloak drawn tight against the chill. In her hand, she clutched the ledger, not the copy she had made for the lighthouse keeper, but the original, heavy with the smell of salt and mildew. It felt less like a book now and more like an anchor, something meant to pull her under if she dared keep it too long. She was not supposed to be here. Caldwell had warned her that the pier was watched, that too many of the names in that ledger belonged to men who had eyes everywhere. But she had followed a hunch, one sparked by the smeared ink she'd found on the sixth name. She had traced it to a shipment log in the dockmaster's office, one that showed a small boat had been ordered for a late departure the previous night, yet had never returned. The boat was registered to a man whose name was in the ledger, and whose house now stood locked and empty. The smell hit her before she reached the first rotting pylon. It was sharp, metallic, and wrong. She stopped, crouched, and saw what the tide had begun to uncover. A pair of boots protruding from the wet sand, the rest of the figure still buried. The leather was stiff with salt, but the laces were tied in a neat knot, just like the one she'd seen on the corpse found weeks ago. And just like that other man, this one had something in his pocket. She pried it out, a folded scrap of paper, stained with water. The ink was blurred, but the words were still legible. Taman Shud, the same phrase that had haunted the first discovery. Finished. Ended. A full stop at the end of a life. Behind her, Wood groaned. Eliza turned sharply toward the pier. A figure stepped into view, silhouetted by the dying sun. The wind caught the edge of his coat, making it flap like a broken sail. She knew him instantly, Rook, with that same unreadable smile. He was holding something small in his gloved hand, and it wasn't until the light caught it that she saw the glint of metal. "You've been busy," he said, his voice almost amused. "Following the wrong leads, though. Dangerous habit, that." She took a step back, the water lapping cold at her ankles. "You knew," she said. "I knew enough." He tilted his head. "The ledger's not for you. It's for those who understand its value." Her grip on the book tightened. "You killed him. The man they found." His smile faltered just a little. "No," he said. "I gave him a choice. He made his own end." The wind shifted, carrying the sound of footsteps behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. Two more figures had emerged from the shadows under the pier, faces hidden beneath low-brimmed hats. Trapped, the water behind her, the pier ahead. Rook stepped closer, his boots silent on the damp wood. "I'll give you the same choice," he said, gesturing to the ledger. "Hand it over and you walk away. Keep it and you won't see another sunrise." Something in his tone told her the choice wasn't real. She thought of Caldwell, of the lighthouse keeper, of the names in that book, who had no idea they were marked. Her heart hammered so loud she thought they might hear it. Without speaking, she threw the ledger, not to Rook, but into the water. It landed with a dull splash, the tide swallowing it almost instantly. His expression hardened, and the two men behind her began to move forward. She ran, not toward the sand, but under the pier, where the pillars formed a forest of slick wood. The tide was rising now, faster than she'd expected, forcing her to wade knee-deep in freezing water. She could hear them following, boots splashing, curses carried away by the wind. A wave hit her hard from the side, nearly knocking her off her feet, but she kept going, using the dark to hide her path. When she emerged on the far side of the pier, the beach was deserted. The lighthouse's beams swept lazily across the horizon, a slow, silent signal. She stumbled toward it, every muscle burning, until the sand gave way to the narrow cliff path. Halfway up, she looked back. The pier stood against the twilight, the water now curling around its base like black ink. Rook was there, watching her, though he made no move to follow. She reached the lighthouse door and pounded on it until her fists ached. It swung open, revealing the keeper, his weathered face pale at the sight of her. She pushed past him, slamming the door shut, the echoes rolling through the stone tower. "The ledger," she began. "I know," he said, cutting her off. "We've sent word already, but there's something you must see." He led her to the small table near the base of the lantern, where a fresh sheet of paper lay. Her copied list of names had been unfolded and set beside another note. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was hers, but the ink was still wet. "You didn't bring this here?" the keeper asked. Her stomach dropped. Someone had been inside the lighthouse, copying her copy, and they had left before she arrived. And in the bottom corner of the note, written in a hand she didn't know, were two words, Taman Shud. Outside, the sea roared. Somewhere below, the tide was pulling the ledger farther out into the dark, scattering its pages like a flock of startled birds. But Eliza knew it didn't matter anymore. The names were out there now, in more hands than she could imagine, and the game was far from over. She stared at the note, the wedding glistening under the lantern's light, and for the first time since this began, she realized she was not just chasing the truth. The truth was chasing her. And now, so are you. Would you dare to go down to that beach at night and comment what you think you find in the sand?